their tags scan. You can see me at the door, or go to and we'll scan you from yesterday if you forgot to get a scan. Grandfather clause, I have those. And so this morning I'd like to introduce Mr. Paul Cascone with the Argent Corporation, and he's going to be talking to us about the multi-layer zirconia. And welcome, Paul.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. This morning we're going to talk about two relatively new developments with regard to zirconia, and that is fabricating multi-layer zirconia and how that happens and what the science is behind that, and then speed sintering of zirconia. Now, everyone wants to do things a little faster when it comes to processing zirconia, and now we have a little application that may actually be worthwhile. So our learning objectives for today, learning the science behind the multi-layer zirconia. In order to do that, we want to review the nature of dental zirconia a little bit, describe the different types of zirconia, review the methods used to color zirconia, because that talks about our development over the years of zirconia. As you know, zirconia was introduced in 2004, and at the time it was only a substitute for the metal portion of a PFM, and we've come a long way. We've come to monolithic, that requires coloring materials, coloring liquids. We've come through monolithic that is pre-shaded. And now we have a multi-layer, so to better emulate the natural transition of a tooth. And we also want to compare multi-layer zirconia brands. Again, back in 2004, we saw the introduction of a ultra high-strength zirconia upon which you bake porcelain. And at that time, a number of people were marketing zirconias, but it actually was the same material. As a matter of fact, the manufacturer of that material, Toso, sort of made sure of it. Since that time, we've seen developments in how the zirconia is fabricated, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. And now, especially with multi-layer, different companies have taken different approaches in order to provide for a multi-layer zirconia. And we're going to talk about how those differences matter to what you see when you fabricate your restoration. And then we're going to talk about the science behind speed sintering of zirconia. Review the sintering process, determine exactly what we're trying to accomplish, and then impact on the furnace design on sintering, and then how we use speed sintering internally in our outsource center. Okay, now zirconia comes from the mineral zircon, and zircon was one of the first minerals to form in the Earth's crust 3.5 to 4 billion years ago. Now, zircon itself is a fairly simple material. It's here we go. Okay, it's made up of zirconia with silica. Now, I was asked a question last night, does any metal leach out of the zirconia material? And the answer is no. And the reason for that is when you combine, the ZR means zirconium, that's the metal, and then of course O2 means oxygen. There are 2 oxygen atoms for every zirconia atoms. When you combine oxygen with the metal, it changes the nature of the material. And in the case of zirconia, it makes a very inert material. So the zirconium is never going to come out of the zirconia. Oh, by the way, when I say zirconia, that means a ceramic that's tied to oxygen, just like alumina means aluminum, again with oxygen. And that combination goes from aluminum and oxygen to alumina. The same with titanium and oxygen, that's called titania. Of course, iron and oxygen, we call that rust. So that's a little different. Okay, that didn't follow the Latin structure. Okay, so this is the mineral zircon, and this is the most economical commercial mine where the majority of the dental zirconia comes from, or I should say the majority of the dental zircon, or the zircon that winds up in dental zirconia. This is in Jack Hills, Australia. It's the western part of Australia. There's not much there. Geologically, it's a very important part of the world because it's the most untouched from weathering, whether it's water or any type of wind. There are crystals found in here, zircon crystals in particular, that are over 3 billion years old. And they know that because you have these two radioactive materials in there, thorium and uranium, and the radioactivity level is pretty high. And because you know how the thorium and the uranium dissociate when they as they age, you can get very accurate atomic clocks. And as a matter of fact, that's how they measure some geological formations, by looking for the zircon crystals, and then they have this little clock in there that they could calculate backwards so to determine the age of the strata. Now, there's not much else in there except this large amount of silica and these radioactive materials. And the way to get rid of that is to dump it in an acid. And in this case, the acid is extremely strong. It's hydrochloric acid. And the idea is to drop out everything except the zirconia out of the acid. And this is called a feedstock. Now, this process is done mostly in China because it's so environmentally damaging. The Chinese actually have consolidated operations to make this feedstock. So when you hear the material comes from China, don't be too concerned, because everyone's zirconia comes from China for the feedstock. Now, the feedstock gets distributed all over the world. It gets sent to Japan, it gets sent to the United States, it gets sent to Europe in order to fabricate whatever the company wants to fabricate into zirconia. Now, zirconia is used for a wide variety of things, like if you have an automobile that has a diesel or a gasoline engine in it, you have a zirconia oxygen sensor. And at high temperatures, the zirconia can sense the amount of oxygen in the exhaust, and then it'll tell the computer in the car to change the fuel to air ratio. And that's how we get a very fancy carburetor now. And that's how we're able to have the car turn off while we're waiting for a stop sign. Anyway, what you do with this feedstock determines how well the material is going to perform. And this process determines the majority of the properties of the zirconia. In our case, we add the yttria as a chloride right in this into this feedstock. And that gives us a very intimate pairing between the zirconia and the yttria oxide. Now, why are we adding yttria? Zirconia by itself is a very poor material for structural purposes. And obviously, building and restoration is a structural purpose. Zirconia will actually turn to dust at room temperature if you don't have anything else in it to stabilize the high temperature form of zirconia. Now, originally, they added a material called magnesia, which of course is magnesium with oxygen. And that material stabilized the tetragonal form of the zirconia, and that's the high strength form that can be used for processing materials. And that was called a ceramic steel. And unfortunately, some of our friends in the dental industry have used that in the case of yttria stabilized material, but it's not the same material. Now, I mention that because the yttria combination actually makes it stronger than the magnesia combination. So we're dealing with a material that's much stronger than what was developed back in the 80s. Now, this operation here, as I said, determines what the material is going to look like after it's processed. And it's very critical that we understand the processing of zirconia determines the properties of zirconia. That's very different than our normal materials we have been using for prosthetic devices like alloys or porcelain. In the case of an alloy, if I wanted to make the thermal expansion lower, I add a little platinum. If I want to increase the strength, I could add some tin or indium or manganese. Or in the case of porcelain, if I wanted to change the thermal expansion, I change the ratio of the soda with the potash here. You can't do much with processing on alloys or porcelain, which actually enables you to have a very stable product. However, with zirconia, the only thing we can work with here right now is the composition, adding the yttria, and we have different yttria amounts, which I'll show you in a few minutes. But the processing determines the majority of the properties. So this material is very different than what we're used to handling prosthetic devices. The actual compositions are very simple because of that. They're only 99% of yttria, hafnia, and zirconia. Now, hafnia is a material. Nature sometimes does not allow us to make a material 100% pure. And that's the case, for example, in cobalt. It always carries a little bit of nickel, or vice versa. And in the case of zirconia, we always wind up with a little bit of this hafnia in there. Now, hafnia is benign. It doesn't affect the properties. It doesn't affect whether they're thermal properties or mechanical properties. It just can't be removed 100%. Now, I'm showing here less than 5%. Most companies that do provide for the composition of their materials will show less than 5%. In most cases, it's less than 2%. But as I said, it's a benign material. You're just going to see it there in case you ask for an MSDS sheet, or you look at, or the company that you're dealing with does provide for the composition. By the way, the ISO specification for zirconia that's used by the FDA does not require the company to divulge the composition of the zirconia. So if you're using a zirconia, or if you see a zirconia from the earlier days, you may find that some of those companies don't provide for what is actually in the product. And most other companies nowadays do. Anyway, what's in there is going to be yttria, anywhere between 5 and 10 weight %, and that determines most of the overall properties. As the yttria content increases, in general, the ductility, the translucency will increase, and the strength may go down, but that's not a hard and fast rule. Now, alumina was added initially to prevent something called aging, and this is where the zirconia actually falls apart. And this happened when zirconia was used in hip joints. The zirconia, the water in the bodily fluids were actually getting forced into the grain boundaries of zirconia, and that just broke it apart. By putting a little bit of alumina in there, they found that they could stop it from happening, and that made it opaque. And that's why the initial materials like Zircon were opaque. And today, even if you use a high-strength material that you're going to bake porcelain on, those materials are opaque because of this amount of alumina. Now, there are some companies that jumped into the bandwagon very fast, and some companies that held back. And the reason why they held back is because of this problem here. If you take the alumina out, you risk actually the structural integrity of the material, and no one really knew how that was going to happen because this product was not developed for the dental marketplace initially. So some companies held back until we understood how this alumina content could be reduced without disturbing the aging problem. And nowadays we have materials like our HT Plus, for example, that has less than 0.1% alumina, and it's very nice and translucent. So. Now, as I said, there are different types of zirconia. The first ones were like 5.5% yttria, and those were the high-strength brands, the high-strength types like Zircon. And I'm using our Argon brand here, Ultra. And that had a very high strength because it was being used in thin wall sections. You only had 4/10 or 5/10 wall that you're going to bake porcelain on. But the translucency was poor, less than 30%. And then full contour zirconia came out, and in our case, we marketed it as aesthetic, and that only had a strength of like 1,100 psi, but the 1,100 megapascals, but the translucency was much higher. And now you're starting to see a material that could actually be somewhat close to a natural dentition, be colored to look like a natural dentition. Then when we developed this HT Plus, our idea was to keep the strength the same, but increase the translucency. And we actually wound up with a double benefit here because the processing modification actually increased the strength over the aesthetic materials while we still got a higher translucency. So because of this result, on the research side, we actually dropped the aesthetic brand from sale. The interior was introduced, and you can see here the translucency is very high, and this material is restricted to 3 units, no more than 3 units, because of this strength level here. This happens to be high for this particular material. Most companies sell this at like 650 or so, or even lower. But in our case, we got 765. And then when we made our multi-layer one, we were actually able to increase the strength a little more and keep the translucency. So what we're seeing here is a natural progression, and this isn't, I'll show you some other companies' materials as well, but it shows a natural progression. We show a strength increase and a translucency increase, which is what we're trying to accomplish. Okay. Okay. Now, Dr. Christensen started promoting a shortcut name for these materials. He talked about the 3Y and 5Y zirconia, and all that means is the amount of yttria in the material. Unlike alloys, ceramics cannot be made exactly the same every time. So that's why you see here I have about 5.5% yttria in these materials, like the Zircon or the 3M lava, and it could vary between like 5.2 to 5.7% yttria. However, for a ceramic engineer, they use something else called mole percent, and that's 3 mole percent or 3Y, and that's the abbreviation that's used. So when you hear 3Y, 4Y, 5Y, and you'll probably hear it from your clients, the dentists that may be listening to Dr. Christensen, they may ask you, is your zirconia 3Y, 4Y, or 5Y? And what they're talking about is the mole percent here. So if you don't have it, don't hesitate to call, and we'll let you know, okay? But these are the types of zirconia that fall into the different categories. Bruxer and Nexer are all 3Y, as our aesthetic was. Okay. Now, the sintering temperature of the 3Y, I just want to go back a minute. A lot of people saw that the 3Y material, like the Bruxer or aesthetic or the Nixer, they realized that if they fire it at a higher temperature, it gets a little more translucent. And some people were firing these up to like 1600 degrees C in order to gain that translucency. You can't do that anymore with the newer zirconias. And here I'll show you on our HC+, as the firing temperature goes up, we improve the translucency and then start to decrease it. So you have to be careful and follow the instructions a little closer with the newer brands of zirconia, because you may sacrifice some of the properties that the reason why you bought it is because it looked good, and if you overfire it, it may not look as good as you remembered it. Okay. Now this is for the white material. As you go to the pre-shaded materials, when we add the coloring materials to it, those actually add as sintering aids. So like the pre-shaded material or the multi-layer, the firing temperature is going to be a little lower than 1550, closer to 1510. One of the things we always recommend is for you to use a Ptcr ring. And these are little rings made out of alumina. And this is the proper way of putting it in your tray. What you want to do is make sure that you put it in the tray with a full tray, because the zirconia does not pick up heat very fast, and neither does it release heat very fast. So you have to be careful. The temperature in the furnace is not going to be the temperature of the zirconia. So what does that mean? That means you can't run a Ptcr ring by itself in the furnace. You have to use it with the work, because the zirconia is going to pick up some heat, which is going to be reflected in the Ptcr ring. Now, how do these things work? Well, these things come when you buy them, and you could buy them at Prairie Ceramics or Zon or a number of places. When you buy them, they come with a little sheet. For that lot of material, it correlates the temperature with the size of the disc. So as the temperature goes up, this disc will shrink, and the amount it shrinks at the end determines the maximum temperature that it saw. And that's the temperature of your furnace. So again, what you want to use is the HTH. Those are the thicker ones. Those are 7 millimeters, or you could use a 3.5 one, but 7 one is what we recommend, because it better emulates the thickness of your like a Pontic or an occlusal surface. Okay. Now, as the zirconia has changed in the marketplace, we changed the operation that you need to do in order to use it. First, we started off with the white material, which required you to use coloring liquids. Now, this gives you the most control to produce a transitional effect, and the aim is to individualize each case. The negatives, though, were very dependent upon the practitioner, and the results may be inconsistent. Now, we run into problems with this when you have, let's say, multiple single units for the same case, and you don't process them at the same time. You could get a different coloring result that may not be accepted by the dentist. Okay. So then we started working with pre-shaded materials. And these give you a consistent shade throughout the entire restoration, because it's all one shade throughout the disc. It's most consistent for bridge work, and I'll show you an example of that. Negatives not too much, but may still need staining. You still need to add that graying effect to get the incisal right, and a little higher inventory cost, because now you're buying not only more shades, but you're also buying different sizes. And now with multi-layer, it saves you a lot of work, because now you have an automatic transitional effect, and which we'll show you on a number of shades. And the goal here is that you just have to mill it and glaze and go. You're done. The negatives, well, you have to be a little more careful how you nest it, because you want to make sure you get both the incisal and the gingival into that case. And you have a higher inventory cost, again, because you have to stock all the shades and different sizes, especially if you're doing large span bridges. Okay. Now, here's a case where it's really best done by dipped. Here, the doctor gave you 2 of the master ceramic colors, and this can only be done by dipping. And it's an aggressive case. There's no question about that. Here we have a 4-unit bridge, 2 heavy pontics and 2 very thin abutments. But if you use a pre-shaded, you're going to get consistent shades all across. Now, you may remember if you try to do this in white and try to use coloring liquids, now the coloring liquids are going to give you 1 shade on the thin abutments, and then maybe a different shade on these heavy pontics if you didn't put an inhibitor in there. Okay. And now we're going to talk about the difference between the pre-shaded zirconia and the multilayer. But before I go on, does anyone have any questions on what we spoke about so far? None at all? Okay. Okay, so now I'm going to show you examples of what these things look like between the pre-shaded and the multi-layer. Pre-shaded is always going to be on the left-hand side. And you see here, this is an A2. I have the shade guides on the next ones. Here you see the shade, an A2, and here you see the nice transitional effect with the multi-layer. So with the multi-layer, what we do is we have different compositions, and in our case, we have 5 different compositions that get molded together. And the gingival has a darker, or larger amount of coloring oxides than the incisal, and then we vary the coloring liquid, the coloring oxides in the material as you go from the gingival down to the incisal. Okay. Here's a B2 with the shade guide, and you can see we're emulating the shade guide much closer with the multi-layer than we are with the pre-shaded. Pre-shaded is a good match, but again, with pre-shaded, generally we wind up with the middle third being close to the shade. And again, with the multi-layer, we're able to emulate the shade guide much closer, and we get that neck color as well. Okay. Here's a little darker, little C2. And again, you can see that the multi-layer is emulating the shade guide much closer. As you know, a difficult one, B1. And in this case, the pre-shaded looks pretty good, but the multi-layer looks a lot better. And again, we're able to show a nice transition between the incisal and the gingival. B3. People that smoke a little more, anyway. C4. Here you're starting to see a greater gradation between the incisal and the gingival. Now you get a darker shade, and again, it matches the shade guide a little better than the pre-shaded ones. Okay. Now a very difficult one, a D2. A lot of people cut off that end so it doesn't disturb the third when you're looking at it. But again, with multi-layer, we're able to emulate that color on the shade guide very well. So this shade in particular works very well for multi-layer. All of the A1s and A, B, C, and D2s are much better on the multi-layer in particular. And of course, you always want to evaluate the shade when it's on the die. because if you have light coming through it, it's not going to be the same, it's not going to look the same as it does with the dye on there. And if you have a stump shade, that's even better. Okay, now we're going to talk about 3 different companies' approaches to building multi-layer zirconia. Katana, as you know, was the first company to introduce multi-layer zirconia, and they decided on a 4-layer structure. And what they do is, for independent of the size of the disc, they keep the enamel layer at 35%, and then 2 transition layers, and then finally a body or a gingival layer, again at 35%. So they keep these percentages independent of the size of the disc, which sometimes results in not enough coloration in the middle third of the restoration. Okay. Now Ivoclar took a very different approach. They put a 5Y zirconia on the incisal layer, but they kept the size of the incisal layer the same, independent of the thickness of the disc. And we were very concerned about that. We were very curious about that because they only varied the dentin zone here, or the gingival layer. And, you know, me personally, I have 2 questions. Why sacrifice the strength of the incisal layer, number 1? Here we have an incisal layer, the strength is only 650 megapascals, and the dentin layer is 1200 megapascals. And then, because the incisal layer is so thin, as you increase the thickness of the disc, how can you nest long-span bridges? So these are the 2 questions that we asked ourselves when we saw this type of approach. Now, the first thing when you look at it, you say, well, okay, we could put a weaker material on the surface, on the incisal layer, because, for example, when we have a bridge and that bridge goes into function, the occlusal layer is going to be in compression, but the intaglia surface is going to be in tension. So if I have a 3Y, I have a stronger material down here than I have on top, I'll be okay. And that sounds reasonable, and sure enough, when you do the computer studies, you find that's exactly what happens. Here you have, this is called a finite element analysis. The computer determines how the strength is going to be, how the stress is going to be distributed throughout the units. And sure enough, we find we have compression at the top and tension at the bottom when this bridge goes into function. So the analysis seems to be justified. Okay, we have a 3Y up here, we're okay. We have a 5Y up here, we're okay. We have a 3Y down at the bottom, we're okay. So that looks okay. But generally, we don't get fractures on bridges like this. So maybe the fact that happens to be a 5Y is sort of incidental to the actual reasons. Now, our friends at Glidewell gave us this nice formula for connectors, and most people have been following it. The width of the connector matters now, and height is the most important factor. They demonstrated the height was most important by multiplying it by itself. So the height of the connector is the most important factor for zirconia. Just keep that in mind. Okay? And then we see something like this. When we see fractured bridges like this, it's not because there was too much stress applied to it, but yet what we find is that these are results of people trying to get a little too aggressive with a hard diamond disc on trying to open up the embrasures. Now I know why you're trying to open up the embrasures, because zirconia generally doesn't look as good as what dental porcelain does. And when you have dental porcelain, you can make a very nice separation between units. You just take your knife and you slice right in there in the interproximal area, and you can't do that with zirconia. I understand why you're doing this, why some people do this, but you really shouldn't. Now, we get units back, and this one happens to come from Glywell because I like the way they illustrated it. You see, when you use a diamond disc on a sintered zirconia, you can't get away with it if you send it in for analysis. You can't say, oh, the zirconia broke, because the diamond disc leaves a fingerprint, and I could find that fingerprint. And we've gotten so good at it now, I could even tell if the diamond disc has been worn. So, and say you need a new diamond disc. But you shouldn't use a diamond disc on sintered zirconia at all. I know you want to get the visual separation between them. Try and do that in the milled state prior to sintering, because when you apply a diamond disc onto sintered zirconia, you're adding energy into the zirconia, and anytime you add energy into the zirconia, it wants to transform, and when it transforms, it increases the size by 7%. Now, a good visual on that, just consider what happens when you put ice cube tray in your refrigerator. When you take it out, those ice cubes are larger than the water volume that you had put in. And that's exactly what happens with the zirconia when it transforms. It increases. As a matter of fact, it increases a little more than the water does in the ice cube tray. So that difference in size causes the zirconia to fracture. And unfortunately, zirconia does not heal itself. The fracture happens at the speed of sound, so you're not going to stop it. And unfortunately, we're still faced with this. Now, in order to improve aesthetics, a couple of companies have come out with this C-clamp, and with the newer software now, like the newer SimSystems mill box, you could actually mill at a 90-degree angle and get that separation that you're looking for. Otherwise, you're going to wind up with this. You may notice that there's 2 pontics missing here. Again, they tried to open up the embrasure a little bit, and it just fractured the minute it went into function. So we don't like to see these. No one likes to see these because that means you're going to have to redo the case. But you may want to invest in something like this if you do a lot of long span bridges, because this is going to give you a better aesthetic result than trying to do it yourself by hand. Okay. We do, however, see these types of fractures very often. Molars and premolars that just crack open. And here, this is not a case where the person has tried to change a contact or modify a contact or something. Here, it's strictly because of a mechanical factor. As you know, the occlusal area has the highest amount of stress due to the biting force. Our biting force on our arch is very low, and the interior portion of the mouth, and very high in the posterior portion. And here we're dealing with about 400 Newton application. And that's like on the average. It could go up to 600 Newtons depending on the person, depending on how large the person is. So here's where we see a substantial amount of stress. And if we, again, look at the computer, here's a stress distribution on an incisor. It's very low. All of the stresses are below 400 megapascals. So that most materials will survive that without any difficulty at all. Okay. However, we have a circumstance with molars that's a little different because we have an occlusal fossa. And that fossa acts as a stress riser. And when you do the computer work on that, sure enough, here you see the stress goes in opposite directions. That means this is in tension. So before we saw that bridge actually had the occlusal surface in compression, and we thought that was good because that's where our 3Y was in the case of the Ivoclar material. But in fact, on the molars, you don't have that situation. On molars, even though it's a single unit, when that goes into function, because of the occlusal fossa, you're going to have a tensile force in that area. So again, we see fractures on molars a little greater on some of those multi-layer ones. Yeah. So which is stronger, 4Y or 3Y and 5Y? Well, here's a study that was done by the University of North Carolina very recently. And here they show that the 4Y, here's our HT plus, actually is much stronger than the 3Y and 5Y combination, okay? Or even stronger than the 4Y and 5Y combination. There's one company that has a multi-layer route where they put the 5Y zirconia on top of 4Y in order to try and gain the strength from the 4Y, but they don't. They actually lose it because of the 5Y. And all of this is due to exactly what I was talking about a minute ago, and that is in some cases you're going to see tension on the occlusal plane, and when you get that circumstance, the stress is going to go down. The strength of the material is going to go down. So staying with a 4Y zirconia throughout the entire thing, you have 1,200 megapascals throughout the entire unit, and you don't have to worry about losing strength or losing translucency for that matter. Now, we all know that dentists don't give us adequate tooth prep. One of the things that Dr. Christensen is trying to do is trying to correct that. And he's looking for greater than a millimeter. It's always nice to get greater than a millimeter, but sometimes we wind up with 0.3 of a millimeter, as you know. So using a material that's strong throughout the entire restoration is probably the best idea. Now, one of the things I indicated was why keep the incisal layer so thin? We didn't understand why they did that because long span bridges have curves to them. We have two natural curves in natural dentition, as you're aware of, the curve of Wilson and then the curve of Spee. And this is the reason why we need thicker disc. Because as the curve increases, as the number of units increases, the curvature is going to go up, and we need to seat those units in that disc a little better, and we need a thicker disc to do that. So our approach to multi-layer was a little different than the other two. What we do is we keep an incisal layer that's going to work for the case, independent of the thickness of the disc, but we increase it as the disc increases. Somewhat similar to what Katana did, only we have larger transitional layers as well, and a larger dentin layer. So it's sort of like the both of what, a combination of both of what Katana did and what Ivoclar did. And we find this situation to work very well, especially for large bridges. As the size of the disc increases, the transition layers also will be modified. The incisal layer gets modified. You see here we have a much larger incisal layer than we do on the 12, on the 30. And we also make 30s. Some companies don't make them that large. And the transition layers also get modified. And we take into consideration those natural curves that are in dentition, natural dentition. And our materials wind up to be a little easier to nest. And again, you have a high strength level throughout the entire restoration, and as well a higher translucency. Now, the result is when you compare them, Again, we're able to get, this is the Ivoclar one here, we're able to get a little better coloration and match the shade guide a little better. And again, here you see, in this case, this was nested the way they needed to for this particular thickness, and ours shows a little better coloration as well. Here's the bridge. And in all cases, our HTML will match the shade guide better. So. Now, one of the things that we did recognize is that the large span bridges, especially the all-on-4 bridges, change the shade of the material because of the thickness of the zirconia. The thicker the zirconia, the less light goes through it, so we have to modify the composition of the coloring oxides. And we've done that. We've done that, and now we have light shades. And for fairly thick restorations, like those all-on-4, you can see the light shade actually matches the shade guide better than the regular HTML. Okay. Even on a D2 or on a darker shade like an A3, the light shades are much better for the long span bridges where you're going to have a large, thick amount of zirconia, like the all-on-4 bridges, as you know. Okay, any questions? Anything? No? No questions? Okay. Okay, we're going much faster than I thought. Okay. Okay, so on centering zirconia, what are we trying to accomplish when we center zirconia?
I have a question.
Oh, sure.
Who has the patent rights on layering?
I'm sorry?
Who has the patent rights on layering?
There are different patents for different types of layering. Yeah. So we have a, yeah. So one of the things about patents is that you could get a patent on a methodology, or you could get a patent on the material. So some patents cover materials, and some patent covers how those materials are put together. Yeah.
When you first showed the katana, you said that they first came out with the layering, and so I was wondering if it was that.
And also some processes just can't be patented because they're so old. There was something developed in the 80s called functional variation, and these were materials that varied in composition by layer. One thing you could think of immediately is a battery. A battery has two different layers in it, and that generates the electricity. So a lot of work was done on powders, especially ceramic powders in the 80s, that were functionally gradient, and that is multi-layer. So in a lot of cases, we couldn't patent some things because of those older, because of that technology is actually old.
I was just wondering, because if like you have, the layers like 4 or 5 layers, if you inverted a couple of 2 of the layers, let's say layer 3 and layer 4, you inverted them, would you be not even patent?
Oh, it just wouldn't look as good.
Understood.
Yeah.
Yeah, you might have a visible line.
Yeah, right. Okay, so on centering, we're trying to do 2 things. Number one, the development of shade. As you know, when you look at those discs, regardless of what shade it says on the side, they all look the same. And the reason for that is that the color is only developed at high temperatures, over 1100 degrees C. Over firing some of these newer materials, however, again, as I mentioned, could result in opacification. So we have to be careful as to what temperature we're going to be sintering at. And also, of course, we're trying to achieve full density by shrinking to size. As you know, every disc has a shrink factor on it. You put that shrink factor into your mill, and the mill automatically expands the file in order to accommodate for that, and it assumes it's going to shrink back to its original size according to what the STL file is. And we want to develop strength and translucency. So here we have a case where, as I mentioned, when you put the coloring oxides in there, the temperature matters, and the temperature that you fire it at, it could change the result. And here we have a 1500 degree and a 1550, and you see the 1550 is a little too bright compared to the tab as opposed to the 1500. Okay? And here, if we just extend it a little further, 1450, 1500, 1550, you see that 1550 looks like it's overdone, it's starting to get bleached out, and 1450 isn't fully developed yet. So the sintering temperature on the multi-layer in particular, and appreciated in general, does matter. So we have to be just a little more cognizant of that when we do our sintering. Okay. Now, we've always tried to do sintering of zirconia a little faster than what the original instructions say. The original instructions, just to give you a little background, every company that manufactures a product has to provide for instructions, and these are considered medical devices. So we have to provide instructions that are going to work for the general case. So what's a general case? Well, a general case is someone that's just going to follow the instructions, okay? And that means, most people have to just follow the instructions, and bingo, it has to work. So the instructions are going to be conservative, because we have to make sure that it's going to work every time if you follow the instructions. Okay? Now, there's always other things you can do, and one of the things that we're looking at now is trying to tap into this very high surface energy. The zirconia particles are very, very small. They're actually nano size, and here's 100 nanometers, and this is a zirconia particle that's floating around. And that means that there's a very high surface energy. If you could tap into that surface energy, then you could have this material sinter very, very fast, much faster than normal. Here's a consideration of what here's an example of two different recommendations for sintering monolithic zirconia. Here we have one that goes up at two different rates, holds it for 2 hours, and then comes down at a fairly slow rate. And here we have another one that's much more aggressive, but then they have a hold. And then and a little more complicated firing structure, again, a hold at high temperature, about 1500, and then this one comes down a little faster. Okay? So what's the difference between these two? There's really no difference between these two with regard to the material. It's just how the particular manufacturer decided to present their case. Okay? Okay. Now, sintering requires energy because we're trying to get from a 60% dense material, that's what the density of that disc is that you're milling, into 100% dense. And remember, zirconia is not like dental porcelain, it's not a glass, it actually is a crystalline material. Closer and it's a crystalline material like a metal is a crystal, only the grain boundaries are very weak. But we want to go from 60% dense to 100% dense. What does that mean? We got to get rid of these air pockets in there. Now, traditionally, if you tried to do this with some devices, you could find something called a master sintering curve, and this is what's done on every material that we develop. You change the rate, and you start and you stop, and you're trying to find a curve that's going to work for all different cases. And when you find that, now you calculate what the activation energy is. Now, if you use conventional heating, you only wind up with one curve. So you have to follow a fairly conservative sintering cycle. You know, like 4 hours for, like, say, a 3-unit bridge or something like that, or single units. However, if you could tap into that extra energy, now we could go a little faster, and we could get denser faster, and that's what we're trying to do. So, if you do it traditionally and just try and move the furnace faster, what happens is you leave pores behind. You see this, the grain boundary just sweeps away the oxygen or the air, and if you go a little too fast, then you're going to leave these little holes behind, and these reduce your translucency as well as your strength. So we need to make something work the way it wasn't designed to work. Here we have a nice old basset hound with a rocket on it. So how do we do that? Well, there are different methods of doing that. There's something called spark plasma, which is zapping it with a high electrical current. And you could achieve full density in seconds. Unfortunately, there's no dimensional control over it. So that doesn't help us. We can get the full density, but we're going to wind up with something like a potato chip. Microwave, you may remember back in about 10 years ago, people were trying to sinter zirconia in a microwave, and this depended upon what device you put it in the microwave. But again, you could sinter in minutes, but there was no dimensional control. Now, a regular cycle is 4 to 5.5 hours, and the bridge cycle is much longer. The bridge cycle is much longer because of what I mentioned before, and that is that zirconia does not conduct heat very fast, does not absorb heat very fast, and does not lose heat very fast. So when you have a lot of units put together, you have a lot of points of possible failure. And the faster you go with a bridge, the worse the result could be. Now, for small units and single units, we've seen the introduction of this particular furnace, KDF speed, and here the time to achieve full density is like 90 to 120 minutes. So it's a substantially better approach than what we're used to. Now, there's 2 types of heating elements. There's molybdenum disilicide. This is the traditional heating element. And then, in order to go faster, some manufacturers have introduced these heating elements with silicon carbide. And these are generally smaller furnaces because, again, you have to heat the furnace at the same time you're heating the work, right? And with silicon carbide, they put out a lot of energy fast, but it's not a lot of heat flux. No, so it can't heat up a big furnace. And generally you want to use a beadless tray. Again, the less material you have in there, the better. And generally you do like 1 to 7 units. You get a fast heat up and a fast cool down, but you may not be able to develop some shades. Now, we've had a couple of clients that have tried this, and they've done very well by it. But for example, as I was talking about the different shades, shade development is very difficult. So like in order to get an A2, they start off with an A3. Because again, that A3 doesn't develop 100%, but it looks closer to an A2. So you have to develop your own system, which some clients have done. Okay? With the moly disilicide, generally you want to have a large furnace. You want multiple trays. It can handle large bridges, and this requires a slow heat up and a slow cool down. So with the moly disilicide, for most of these large furnaces, you have to rely and stay with the long sintering cycle. So you can't take a furnace and modify it to do a fast speed. You can't take the moly disilicide furnace as a regular furnace and just go faster with it. You can put any number you want on that on the program, but the furnace is not necessarily going to react that way. Okay? Now we see the introduction of this furnace. This is somewhat unique, and what the unique part about it is it uses moly disilicide in a little different way, but it has this crazy thing inside of it. Here's where you put your work, and these are made out of a graphite material. There's an alumina tray you place the work on, And again, you're using this is a small diameter furnace, so you want to do single units mostly. Don't put the unit against the ceramic, against the graphite, because that may leave you a white spot. But if you keep the units on the ceramic, you can fire the units in like 90 minutes. And they do come out fully dense, and they do have full shade development. And they've used a couple of very scientific tricks. They leave some of these areas open, and that actually allows the carbon to get hot very, very fast and provide for a lot of heat going into the work. And it's a very interesting device, and it works. We found that it works very well, especially for single units. And here's our evaluation report. Now what we did here, we tested for the strength of the material as well as the translucency of the material. Okay. So first we just take our regular material and we do a standard cycle, which is like 450 minutes, and then a fast cycle here is 105 minutes for this particular product. Now we look at the color and the translucency of the material, and we see for the regular cycle we're like 37%, and for the fast fire cycle we're at 36%. So that's not bad. Again, this is a colored material, so you're not going to get a full 45% translucency. But the results are not bad comparing the two. Here's 450 minutes, here's 100 minutes, a fourth of that, and you develop it pretty well. And you see on the color itself, the hue is a little different. We go from like 88 to 87. So we did a slight difference in hue, but it modified, it came out with the shade close to the shade guide. Okay. And here's the full transmission, the regular cycle and the fast fire, and you see they trace very, very well. These little dips are where the coloring material is absorbing the light and reflecting it. So here you have a manganese gray, cobalt blue, and the iron yellow. Okay. So when you look at the units themselves, they look fairly good, and they're fairly consistent. So, on the strength, we did the strength 2 times because I didn't believe the first result. And our normal strength is like 1250 megapascals, and we got up to 1210 and 1237. So first round of testing was very close. Second round of testing was a little closer. And again, these are just processing it at 105 minutes. As opposed to the 450 minutes. So based on the results of the speed sintering, we have no significant effect on the strength of the HC Plus material, and the shade development in the short cycle was also very good. So we accomplished both of what we tried to do in a very short amount of time. So if you're interested in doing speed cycle of single units, you may want to look into this. Okay. Okay. Any questions? Yes.
How does the bridge do on the speed side? Like a 3-unit bridge or a 4-unit bridge?
The answer is it depends. It depends on the thickness of the bridge. If you have a fairly thin bridge, let's say an interior bridge, it works fairly well. If you have a posterior bridge with a large pontic, it may not work as good. So, again, if you consider what we're trying to do, we're trying to tap into the thin, small particle size. So the larger the number of particles, the less effective we're going to be. Right? Any other questions?
I got one here.
Yeah.
So you're up to Argon's up to 50% translucency on the ST. Are they working on going higher? Or about where we'll be?
Okay. Now, okay. So you read that I was the head of R&D, right?
You should know that.
Yeah. So going higher is difficult. Going higher means you have to raise the yttria content of this material right now. We're trying a little different approach. Yeah.
That didn't answer my question. You're avoiding the question.
I answered the question. The question was yes, we're trying to. Okay, so this gentleman asked about patents. Okay, right now we're faced with hundreds of patents on zirconia, and you're able to, in some cases, you're able to take a patent that was developed 10 years ago and modify it to work with your particular circumstance under very particular conditions. Okay, and yeah, you could get that. That doesn't work very well because you're the ones that are doing the processing. You know, I'm not doing all the processing. Okay? I mean, you could send me all your work if you wanted to, but you know, that's a different conversation. That's not part of R&D. Anyway, so what we're trying to do is we're trying to modify the material in such a way that we're out of everyone else's way. And hopefully get a higher translucency level. Yeah. So far we've gotten a little higher, but we've sacrificed the strength, and that doesn't help, right? So yeah. So we did. Yeah. We're working on that. Yeah. Any other questions? Any other embarrassing questions? Okay. Okay. So now we're going to have some fun. Shade and color. Okay, so this is the Vita guide that you're used to. You have the 3 Hollywood bleach shades there, right? And then the normal people shades. Okay. Does anyone? Yeah, well, I call it refrigerator white and chiclet white and anyway. Anyway, anytime you go to the dentist now, they say, before I do the work, do you want me to bleach your teeth? I say, no, I don't want to. I don't want that. Anyway, so what is the dominant you that you see? Now, okay, this is a participation now. You got to talk to me. What is the dominant you that you see?
A2.
What?
A2.
A2. Okay. Well, okay, that's a particular shade. The U is generally the color, the overall color. Okay. Okay. Now try this. What's the dominant hue?
Yellow.
You. Yes. You. What do you see? What color? Yellow. Yeah. How's the peanut gallery over there? What's going on? What do you see? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's impossible. You're human. You can't see yellow. See? So you can't see yellow. This guy can see yellow. This is a Manta Shrimp. A Manta Shrimp sits behind in their little cave underneath the water, and they wait for something to pass by. And either they eat it, run away from it, or have sex with it. That's it. Very limited. Very limited. However, they have one, maybe two, maybe one particular interesting thing about this creature. It has 12 types of photoreceptors. 12 types of photoreceptors. This thing can see polarized light in both directions. It's hyperspectral. It can see infrared. It can see ultraviolet. Now, why does this thing sits in the ocean? It can only do 3 things. Why does it need all of these photoreceptors? No. The other thing about this thing is that if you ever put one in a tank, the way they get their prey is they have these two little clippers on the side, and they whack it, and when they put them together, it goes so fast, it creates a shock wave, and it actually stuns the animal. And that's when they make the determination as to what they're going to do with it. So, anyway, so if you put it in an aquarium, it could actually break the aquarium glass. Anyway, so when you look, it has 12 photoreceptors. Why does this little bugger need 12 photoreceptors? We only have 3. We have blue, we have green, and we have red. Here, this guy has everything. And look at that. There is yellow. Where's yellow? We don't have yellow. So we don't see yellow. We see red, we see green, we see blue, but we don't see yellow. So how did you get yellow? You got yellow because our brain learned that when the red and the green receptors are firing at about the same rate, we call that yellow. So when you were very small, somebody told you that the rubber ducky was yellow. Somebody told you that the banana was yellow. Somebody told you that those egg centers were yellow, egg yolks were yellow. And you said, okay, that's yellow. That's yellow. And then what's going on in your brain? In your brain, those receptors are both the green and the red are firing at the same rate. And that is yellow. So we perceive yellow. We don't see yellow. We perceive yellow. And that's why everybody sees color differently. That's why when you send an A2 to that doctor calls you up and says, hey, this is not an A2. And you're saying, it is an A2. This guy's colorblind. And he might be. Okay. Now, generally, when I show this in front of at a dentist seminar, the room gets extremely quiet, even quieter than here. You could hear a pin drop, and the reason for that is because of the male population. 10 to 12% cannot see all of these numbers. Of the female population, only 0.5% can't see all the numbers. So what does that mean? That means that 10% of the male population are colorblind. So they're only bichromatic. One of those, they're red-green colorblind. One of those receptors aren't working in their head, in their eyes. And that has 2 corollaries to it. Oh, by the way, the defect that causes that is on the Y chromosome. So if you don't have a Y chromosome, like you ladies, you don't have to worry about that. As a matter of fact, about 8% of the female population have an extra receptor. They're tetrachromatic. And when you're tetrachromatic, you could see over and distinguish between over 100 million colors, better than some televisions. It's fantastic. So what's the corollary? Corollary is when you're sitting in that chair and the dentist says you need a crown, you find the nearest woman and say, you take the shade. Don't let that guy take the shade. Don't let that guy take the shade. So that's it. Understanding why different people see color differently, I think, is very important, because as we get more sophisticated on the zirconium materials, we're making finer and finer distinctions. And some people are not going to be able to see those distinctions, and some people are. And one of the things we're faced with on the R&D is how do we develop a product if our population is going to be shrinking? And that's a real problem. So the color you've all experienced it with different dentists. The different dentists, you know, some of them don't understand color, some of them complain about it, and they shouldn't be, and some of them just complain, but that's different. So color is an extremely important part of our business, and that's what I have. So our learning objectives, we tried to look at the science behind the multi-layer, how different companies handle the multi-layer, and the differences between them, and then the science behind speed sintering. And you know, we reviewed one particular furnace that seems to be fairly efficient at it. So far, that's like the only one that we have. Okay. So thank you for your attention, and any other questions? Okay.
I'm at shrimp.
I'm sorry?
I'm at shrimp. The three things it wants to do.
Yeah.
So is it looking for the red, hot color?
Well, these are my bassets, and they only want to do two things. Eat and sleep. That's about it. That's about it. Okay. Anything else? Well, thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate it, being invited here. Thank you. I forgot that. I forgot that it was touchscreen. I'm trying to have something together.
Yeah, no, you can click on anything.
Good job. Very good, yeah.
You start seeing this stuff.
Yeah, one of my vendors brought